when I was young, I was told never apologize, never explain. It's kind of a macho view of leadership. Where today, I apologize easily and I explain everything. 99% of my decisions, I explain the thinking behind it. And why I do that is because I'm happy for younger people to argue with me and go, or older people, and go, that was true, but it's no longer true. Our customers aren't on Facebook, they're on TikTok. Therefore, we need to change what we do. So I want my strategic thinking to be tested by younger people, which in my case is almost everybody, in order to improve it.
This is Net Learnings, the podcast that keeps finance and banking professionals ahead of the curve. In each episode, we focus on career growth and practical advice, while mixing in the occasional war story. Join us as we tap into the minds of leaders and experts at some of the world's most notable financial services firms and enterprises. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Net Learnings. I'm your host, Kyle Peterty. Today's guest is Karl Moore, Associate Professor at McGill University's Des Hôtels Faculty of Management. Karl is an award-winning teacher, researcher, and thought leader in the management and leadership space. He's interviewed over 1,000 CEOs and senior political figures for his CEO series. He writes a regular column for Forbes, and his most recent book came out in spring 2023. It's called Generation Y: How Boomers Can Lead and Work with Millennials and Generation Z. Professor Moore, thank you so much for joining me today.
Kyle, thanks for the opportunity to reach you and your audience. Really appreciate it.
Our listeners have careers in a variety of finance and banking roles. So as a result, many work in very large organizations, right? And as we know, institutions, both big and small, but especially big organizations, are very dynamic and complex organisms. So I'm really excited today. We're going to spend some time with Professor Moore to talk shop about multi-generational management techniques, introversion versus extroversion in the workplace, some career mobility topics, and who really knows what else. Maybe to start, Professor Moore, tell us a bit about yourself and your research, please.
Well, I grew up in Toronto, so I'm Canadian. Went to school in LA and Boston for 6 years, so at Harvard and USC. And then worked for IBM for 11 years in Toronto, Hamilton, Regina. Did my PhD in Toronto and then taught at Oxford for 5 years. And our son Eric came home at age 4 and said, "Daddy, I need a bath." And my wife and I decided it was time to leave England and go back to our native Canada. So I've been at McGill for about 20 years and came here to work with a guy named Henry Mintzberg, one of the most famous business profs in the world, and do a fair bit of work in the banking sector. I do an annual report on family business with the National Bank. It's, as we call it, the 6th largest bank in Canada. Had the CEO to class a couple of weeks ago. And it's looking this year at the environment and interviewed Lena Saputo, Olivier Desmarais, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, as well as, I'm sure remember, a woman who runs a very big organization in Calgary. Her name will come back to me in a minute. So it's something where I've done that for 3 years with them and have a lot of bank CEOs come to class. So it's something in industry I've worked in and sold computers to back in the day with IBM. So it's something where I've worked with the finance industry in Canada for a good 30, 35 years off and on.
Incredible. And in terms of your research, can you tell us a little bit about your research?
Well, I've written a number. It's my 10th book that came out this year. And I've written 3 books on globalization, known world globalization, the Roman Empire, looking at the Syrian, Phoenician, Greek, and Roman empires. And I did it with a historian. And so I've never done a speech for money on it. With the Gen Y stuff, I was in Niagara Falls Monday giving a speech to a Fortune 500 company for very nice payment. But its stuff intellectually is interesting. And it was interesting to look at, we suggested the world's first iBankers were back in Assyria and were around the temple. So the priests lent you money. So it was kind of a priest iBanking role back in the day in Assyria. So we draw some interesting parallels, hopefully without getting carried away, to the modern world, and that there's some things back in the ancient world that were not dissimilar. But most recently, my book on Generation Y is, in one sentence, Kyle's this: arguing that people over 45th degree, c'est moi, were taught a modern worldview. People under 35th degree, that is younger millennials and Zs, were taught a postmodern worldview, therefore must be managed differently. And the book has 6 short chapters on how to manage postmoderns. So that's that book. And the book I'm working on for next year is about introverts, ambiverts, and extroverts as leaders.
Which we're also going to talk about today, and I'm really excited about that. Just curious though, your business background, you mentioned you went to USC. I would have thought that an MBA in that era would be like a direct conduit into a banking or a consulting role, but you didn't go that route. Why didn't you go into finance?
Well, I'd worked, a friend of mine at college had gone to work for IBM. So it's one of the people I knew and respected a lot. He said, oh, IBM, was the high-tech firm of its day. It's hard for you to remember, Kyle, well, you weren't around. But it was something where it was the Google of its day. And so it was very cool to go to IBM and work there, though I did sell to the banking sector in Toronto and across the country. So that's my branch was the banking branch down the TD Bank. So that's where I used to work out of, and the Royal Trust Tower and the RBC and all this sort of thing were places where I cut my teeth on in terms of learning. But IT, we called it IT and computers back then, were central to how the world's going to go forward. And today it's very different, but it's that whole IT sector was very cool. So today, if you say I work for Google or work for Microsoft, that's considered pretty cool. Up there almost with Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and things like that. I would argue anyway, but maybe that's a bit self-serving, I agree.
So what was it about academia then that eventually led you out of industry?
Well, and I'd spent 11 years there, and I'd done well, made good money at it, had been promoted a number of times, but it was all thought and not much, it was all action, little thought. And so the intellectual side appealed to me. So I did a PhD, was all thought, no action. So it went the opposite, the other way too far, where I just spent a couple of years reading books and reading articles. I remember going to we lived in Scarborough, my wife and I there, in an apartment, and I remember going to talk to the guy next door in the convenience store who he only spoke Korean and very little English, but I just wanted human contact. As an extrovert, I wanted human contact, but it was too much where today I write books and do a lot of research, but also out there talking to people. My biggest research method is to do long interviews with CEOs. And so I'm one-on-one with a CEO for an hour, and that's interesting from a research viewpoint, but genuinely it's something I find joy and pleasure in. And so now it's a nice mix of thought and action together. So maybe, the PhD was tough, but towards the end of it, I started doing exec ed at the Schulich School at York and came back to be in a happier place.
You've done a lot of research around introversion and extroversion. You just alluded to it. And finance feels like a good place to explore this, right? Historically, it's been a category where introverts and extroverts can both do really, really well. I think it might be important to just zoom out for a moment, though. We sort of all have an idea of what a person with an introversion preference or extroversion preference probably looks like. But how would a professional researcher characterize these different types of people sort of more formally?
Well, some people confuse shyness with introversion, and they're different ideas. The central construct, when you look at the research, and we've looked at hundreds of articles, is about the response to stimulation. So that's the central idea that introverts love being with people. After a certain amount of stimulation, they tip over, and they need to take introvert breaks and recharge. An extrovert, on the other hand, is someone who seeks out stimulation and finds joy and pleasure in it, and therefore is more apt to work the crowd and spend, at parties, I tend to be the last person to leave because I enjoy it. My wife, as an introvert, wants to leave sooner and sometimes will and just waves goodbye and gives me a kiss goodbye and goes off, where it's a matter of the nature of the hard wiring. Now, it's interesting. They did some research at Harvard a number of years ago where they got 4-month-old babies, and even in Boston, 4-month-old babies don't talk, and they tested their response to stimulation and followed them for decades, and it was a reasonably good predictor of if they'd be more introverted or extroverted as an adult. Now, it's a bell curve, Kyle, and so I'm an extreme extrovert, but most people are a bit extroverted, a bit introverted, not on the extremes. And when I teach this, I always say at this point, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. So when I look at you, Kyle, if I asked your family or good friends or whatever, they say, Kyle is really complex. And to say he's an introvert extrovert is helpful, but there's so much more to Kyle than that. And so when we look at human beings, it's a useful lens to look at people and say they're more introvert or extrovert, and it's helpful in terms of how do I manage them, how do I work with them, if they're peers, how do I manage upward. But it's only one way of looking at people, so don't get carried away. That being said, I'm writing a book on it, and I'm giving lectures on it. But let's take a caveat here that it's only one way to look at people, and there's many other ways, but it's a very useful way. So McKinsey and BCG, I co-teach with the BCG partner. I've done research with McKinsey. Often what they do when they get together in new teams, which happens often, you often don't work with the same people that often, is that you talk about, are you more introverted or extroverted? And if you say you're an introvert, well, after we work, I might give you time to work by yourself because you need that. And at dinner, I'm not going to invite you to dinner. I might invite you, but you may want to say, I want to watch Netflix in my room. I need to recharge. So I'll lean into that. But the extrovert, I'll say, come on, let's go grab some dinner because I know they want to be with people. They don't want to be in the room by themselves necessarily. So it's something where we can use it usefully, but it has its limitations.
Okay, so going back to my point about finance and financial services, have you uncovered any particularly interesting or useful quirks when it comes to this sort of field specifically?
Well, it's interesting. I've talked to a lot of iBankers. And early, typically, and these are typical things in your career, you're doing a lot of PowerPoints, you're doing a lot of Excel spreadsheets, you're doing a lot of analysis, which is more introverted. It's later on where you go with the client to dinner and you pitch it, that it's more extroverted behavior. So it's interesting that early in your career, you're more apt to be doing introverted stuff and later on more extroverted. But it draws a fair number of extroverts because they think what they're going to do. Now, auditing, and in a bank, there'd be auditors, as there should be. Auditors tend to, so I'm waving my hands at this point, because they tend to be more introverted because of the nature of the task. They're going through numbers all day. They're looking at things. They're in their minds, which introverts like to be. On the other hand, the extroverted auditor is kind of a nice thing. It's apt to make partner because we need someone to go schmooze the customers and make sure we keep being their auditing partners. So it's something where both can be very successful, but certain areas tend to draw more introverted, more extroverted people. But if you're off kind of that, you can stand out from the crowd is what I would argue.
It's interesting you talked about the idea of being promoted to partner. I wanted to actually unpack that a little bit. So I assumed historically that on balance, extroverts would tend to be promoted into leadership roles more often than their introverted counterparts. Your book indicated, though, when I was reading it, that was true, but that's evolving and that's changing. Can you give us a bit of background there and maybe just help us understand what the data are saying?
Well, traditionally, we had thought that all leaders are extroverts, but it was based on no data to speak of, but kind of, people writing their biographies and things like that, and noisy people saying noisy things, which are more apt to be extroverted. So I read Susan Cain's book, Quiet, and wrote with one of my students who had been an actress in Degrassi High, so quite an entertaining young person, wrote a Forbes piece that got 66,000 views in one day. A record, like 100 times more than my normal. It was just spinning around relatively in terms of the number of views. And so the next night I had CEO class, so Claude Mongeau, who was the CEO of CN at the time, about 24,000 people. And I'd never asked anyone before if they're more of an introvert or extrovert. But the assumption in the literature that all leaders are extroverts, kind of what was in the back of my mind. And he turned out to be a big introvert. And then the second CEO was a big introvert. This is contrary to what I anticipated. So I started asking every CEO about being introverted or extroverted and had done hundreds of interviews. And actually, probably about 40% of C-suite executives are introverts, probably 40% are extroverts, and 20% are genuine ambiverts. And this is much more diverse than we had thought in the past. But again, the books we read and thought about were 10 or 15 years old already. So the world's moved on. A lot more women leaders. So here at McGill, our dean is a woman. The dean before is a woman. The two principals before them were women and so on. So there's a lot more in academia, a lot of women leaders, and increasingly more in finance, not half and half, but a lot more than 15 to 20 years ago. So we see that we're more open to variety on leadership. You don't have to look like a certain kind of person, nor act a narrow way. And when we see the strengths of introverts, so the title of the book, Kyle, the working title is We're All Ambiverts Now. What I'm arguing is that regardless of your hard wiring, you need to act like an introvert at times and an extrovert at other times, be an effective leader. But you got to be true to yourself. You got to be authentic. And if you're like me, an extrovert, it's the nature of the beast. Lean into it. But I realize as an adult, I've got to act like an introvert to be an effective person at times, particularly effective leader. Got to be a better listener. I got to shut up and actually pay attention rather than just think of the next clever return I'm going to put out there. This is called good leadership in today's world, but I'm going to be true and authentic to my extroverted self, but I'm going to lean into being an introvert when it's required. And I would say introverts have got to lean to be extroverted when they need to give an inspiring speech or they need to work a crowd. They'll do it a bit differently, but they need to lean into that at least a bit.
So a lot of talk about what it means from a leadership perspective. What about all the folks in our membership base and our audience that are individual contributors? What kind of advice do you have for folks to be, more efficient or engage and interact more effectively based on their preference towards either introversion or extroversion?
Well, recognize who you are, and you've got to be authentic. That's one thing about in today's world. We want leaders, we want people to be authentic. So don't wear a mask to work. So be yourself. On the other hand, recognize that if my boss is an extrovert, I'll manage her a bit differently than an introverted boss. So I'll lean a bit into what they like, and I'll manage upward in a helpful way, in a better way, by recognizing who they are. And if people work for me, I want to recognize who they are and honor that and be respectful to that. And myself realize that I have to act like the other, but try to get into circumstances where if you're an introvert or extrovert, that's just a natural part of your day in life. Now, everybody's got a network, it seems these days, or a lot of people have to anyway. Introverts are great networkers, but as they think about it, they kind of look people up on LinkedIn who are going to be at a conference, and they strategically go and talk to someone. Now, I interviewed Paul Desmarais, the billionaire here in Montreal, and big in the finance industry, actually, in insurance and so on. And he and his wife's quite extroverted, he's quite introverted. And Hélène will work a room, and I've seen them, a big room where there's many tables for dinner. She'll go from table to table, and everybody will laugh, and they'll connect with her. Paul will sit and talk for 20 minutes, half an hour with you, Kyle, one-on-one, and mainly ask questions as a good introvert. At the end of that, you go, I love this guy. Here's one of the richest people in the finance sector in Canada who's listening with rapt attention. That's very valuable. And Hélène going around and working in a room is very valuable. They're both very valuable styles, and you got to use both at times to be effective. So I think a little bit of flexibility while leaning into who you are is kind of the way forward, whether it be networking, whether it be what kind of job you take, and various things like that. And we're also more open to a little different approaches in terms of how people approach their jobs in finance or consulting, whatever they may be doing. We're more open than we were 10 or 15 years ago, I would say. Absolutely.
Can you give us an example? Like when you and I first chatted, you gave an example of someone on your team that you were going to maybe call upon in a meeting. Like what are some sort of tangible examples that people can take away, whether it's managing up or interacting with colleagues?
Well, one thing is if someone works for me and I know they're an introvert, 2 days before a meeting, I'll email you, Kyle, and go, Kyle, we want to talk about this in the meeting in 2 days. I know you know something about it. Can you give it some thought? So you'll Google, you'll read articles, you'll get prepared, but you want to think ahead of time. We're all kind of wing it. And it'll be funny and charming, but, it will not be as deep. And then at the meeting, I'll look at you, Kyle, and you'll either nod your head a little bit, then I'll call on you. And if you go no, I won't call on you. Because it's kind of, I understand you're not ready yet. An introvert will typically not speak early in a meeting. They want to hear what other people are saying and connect the dots and get their thinking. But when they do speak, we tend to listen because it's well thought out and it's insightful. So with an introvert, I will allow them to think about it ahead of time and call on them when they're ready. So that's how I'll manage and work with introverts. Whether they work for me or, we're more peers, I'll show respect for them doing that. Where for extroverts, I can call on them almost any time and they'll jump right in. It'll be amusing and charming, and see how I think of ideas, Kyle. I'll go down and see you in your office and I'll bounce off the wall 10 ideas. 8 are dumb. 1 is all right. 1 is excellent. I don't care about the dumb ideas. I'm not embarrassed. Because that's how I get to the one good idea. Where introverts have dumb ideas, they just don't say them aloud. And they don't send them to me by email. They only send one good idea. So it's different ways of thinking. If we recognize that and recognize there's strengths and weaknesses to both and just lean into it, you'll be a better leader.
A better colleague, I presume, too. I think it comes down to
absolutely.
just understanding who you're working with and creating a a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts, if you can really understand that. It's funny you say about throwing 10 ideas out. I was speaking, we teach some leadership concepts here at CFI, and I was talking to our subject matter expert. And one of the ways she described a typical extrovert or person with an extroversion preference was they think out loud as opposed to sort of pre-thinking before speaking. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. It's like throwing a whole bunch of spaghetti at the wall and one or two of them will stick and they may be very good, but you have to sit through 7 or 8 pieces of spaghetti that slide down and aren't very good.
Well, it just recognizes the nature of the beast. And what you should do is just say, from time to time, be a good audience and go, that's interesting. And interesting is a word where it's neutral. When you go, that's an interesting idea, or it's interesting someone so smart has such a dumb idea. You know, you wouldn't say that aloud, but that's kind of interesting to be taken either other way. And so you just say you're a good audience and let them talk and they'll leave. And they'll go away energized and with a good idea or two, which is exactly what you want from them anyway. The other thing I'll talk about is, I touched on introvert breaks. How, you tip over, you take breaks. And I read there was no literature on extrovert breaks. And I thought, how typical. But it's something that I'm sitting in my office here in McGill, and I'm writing for a couple hours, ironically, a book about introverts. At a certain point, I can't take it anymore. Do you hear the pain in my voice, Carl? I can't handle it. So I go out the door to the lounge where there's an endless supply of students I am teaching and giving grades to, so they're going to be nice to me, admittedly. But they'll talk to me, and they'll enjoy the conversation, and they'll often tease me, extrovert break? And I go, yeah, I'm refilling my batteries by talking to you.
You definitely have me thinking about water cooler banter a whole lot differently. This is a very unique perspective, and I appreciate it. Okay, I want to talk about generational divides and differences now, and hopefully we can really leave our audience with some super tangible takeaways when it comes to thriving in a workplace where there's multiple generations that have to execute on shared goals and collaborate. You already stated, so boomers, just to clarify again, was 35 and up. Could you just sort of break down what the different age categories are, the boomers, millennials, and Gen Zs?
What I'm talking about is moderns are probably 45 and up, and postmoderns are 35 and under. And why I say that is because between 45 and 35, it depends on what subject you studied where, how postmodern you are. But if you're over 45, you're modern. If you're under 35, you're postmodern, is almost certainly true. And so that's why I say that.
Okay. Could you characterize a little bit what the modern worldview is versus the postmodern worldview?
Well, the modern worldview, and most people my age would be increasingly postmodern, but it's what we were brought up with. And I interviewed a General Martin Dempsey, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the most senior general in the U.S. I taught with him at Duke. He got promoted, so he was the guy when Obama went to war, was the guy in the general uniform. And so I interviewed him in the Pentagon in his office, as the most senior general in the world, and he said, one of the things he said was, Carl, generals fight the battles of their youth. What he meant was he was a pup lieutenant out of West Point, had a tank in the Cold War in Germany. He learned a lot about leadership in his 20s, and he was taught about leadership by the colonels and majors who had been young people during Vietnam, when small men in black pajamas jumped out of the jungle, shot, and you disappeared into the tunnels. Then he became a general during Desert Storm, when he actually led and he created strategy. And he said, not entirely, but largely the lessons of leadership and strategy from Vietnam and the Cold War were largely irrelevant for the new war. And the type of leadership had evolved. So to a certain degree, older people over 45, like myself, have got to throw away some things over the side of the boat. That the crystallized wisdom we've developed is wrong to some degree. Now, some of it is still right. Where people that are 22, my undergraduates, they don't have a lot of crystallized wisdom. They've learned a few things, but they don't have a lot to throw away. They're today's people. Where part of it is that I've got to throw away some of the past, and that's a real challenge for people to do. So some of the things the modern worldview were around the nature of truth, the nature of hierarchy. There was a lot more hierarchy back then. I remember going to the doctor when I was a kid. It'd be a man behind a giant desk. It was a man back then. Now we have more women at McGill Medical than men. He had a stethoscope around his neck. He'd have a white coat on, where it was his signs of authority, and the desk would be this huge one you could land an aircraft on. He was here, and we were down there, my mother and I, and she would follow whatever he said. Where today when I go to the doctor, and this is in the postmodern world, it's the nature of hierarchy, the nature of who has truth has changed dramatically. I say to my doc, and I call her Doc first name, Susan, I have 3 theories on what's wrong with me based on Google that I Googled that morning. And I say, what do you think? So I give some credence to her authority, but it's much less than it used to be. And we used to call some doctors or, alternative medicine quacks. Now we call them alternative medicine. And we have a department of alternative medicine at McGill. Things that we used to make fun of, we are now looking at with greater respect. So what is truth? Who has knowledge? Who's in charge has changed. So the postmodern worldview is post after modern because the modern worldview failed. So the postmodern worldview is one that older people would agree with considerably, but they're still kind of messed up, as I am occasionally, by my old worldview, and I haven't got rid of it enough. Where young people just aren't messed up by it because they don't have it. So it just, part of it is in a turbulent world, my knowledge is less useful than it used to be, and I must listen to young people more who have today's worldview, and it's one which is more accurate and more with it than my view from 30 years ago, which I still kind of stuck with from time to time.
Hmm. Yeah, so in your book, you spoke about some of these leadership issues and the contemporary perspective. And so you called out 4 in the book. You just specifically mentioned 1 or 2 of those. So the first was knowledge and truth. You talked about hierarchy and more specifically its decline, which you just addressed. You also talked about the way people relate to one another. And then the 4th was the role of emotions in the workplace. Maybe could you give us a quick overview, an example of each of these 4 sort of pillars of contemporary perspective?
Well, the one about emotions and analysis, when I was at IBM, if anybody got emotional, we'd stop the meeting and have coffee. So as soon as emotion reared its ugly head, in those days' terms, we'd stop it because it was all about rational thought and analysis and a mean spreadsheet. Where today, what we recognize, and postmoderns are taught, and mea culpa, I'm screwing up your workforce because we teach this at McGill and U of T and Harvard and around the world, is that emotions are more equal to analysis. And older people go, no. What do the numbers say? And in finance, the numbers speak.
Yeah.
And I think there's a harder truth to that in finance than most industries. But younger people go, well, what do I feel about it is an important thing as well. So what your feelings are, and since COVID, we're much more aware of mental stress. We're working from home, we're on Zoom, and it was something that a lot of people got into meditation and deep breathing and yoga. Partly, and even today, our students much more talk about mental health than they did in the past. So it's that sense of what I feel is more important than it was in the past, and you've got to make room for it. And even in finance, when you deal with people and you try to lead them, you have to make room for their emotions, I think. Would be something which is different than 10 or 15 years ago, for sure.
Yeah, in another interview, it's interesting that you brought that up. This individual talked about how we're in a world today where the solution to problems doesn't necessarily have a net present value. It can't be modeled out. It's not an output from a model because people feel a certain way about issues like, climate change and you name it, right? I mean, the world has changed a lot, and so part of that is generational. But it's interesting to think about how that piece of emotion comes in, and it's not always just about the numbers. The one I really wanted to unpack was, could you give us maybe an example about hierarchy, the decline of hierarchy in the workplace?
Well,
that seems particularly salient in finance.
Well, you think about the medical example, that, the doctor is no longer God, but more, he or she knows more, but, we're more apt to argue with them. It's just that there's just less hierarchy, that I'm the boss, you're not, what don't you understand? It's not something you'd say anymore. Like once in a while it might be implied, where in the past I would listen to people that were higher up in the hierarchy, typically older, and more apt to sleep and do what they said. And I would less argue. So the generation Y, it's spelled W-H-Y, so not the letter Y, but the word
right.
Y. And I wrote an article for the Globe a couple of years ago, and it was the second most viewed article of the year. And it was entitled, Never Apologize, Never Explain Bad Ideas with Millennials. It was 2018. And what I said is that when I was young, I was told never apologize, never explain. It was kind of a macho view of leadership. Where today, I apologize easily, and I explain everything. Now, there's occasionally why we've hired someone who don't explain, but 99% of my decisions, I explain the thinking behind it. And why I do that is because I'm happy for younger people to argue with me and go, or older people, and go, That was true, but it's no longer true. Our customers aren't on Facebook, they're on TikTok. Therefore, we need to change what we do. So I want my strategic thinking to be tested by younger people, which in my case is almost everybody, in order to improve it. So where in the past I just say, here's what we're going to do without explanation, where today you're more apt to explain it because it'll improve your thinking and you'll have better strategy.
I want to read a quote from your book. What university students are taught during pivotal years of their schooling very much influences their behavior at work and their view of how they want to be led. Though, given their worldview, led may be too strong a word. Even managed may be too strong. Perhaps it would be better to say worked with. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, just that there's that sense of lead and manager kind of seen as more manipulative words, where work with, it's more egalitarian. Now, on the other hand, there is a boss, and that's rightly so, and they give you, promotions and they give you rewards, and that's fine, there should be. And to a certain degree, older people are in charge because they have more experience. Like a 25-year-old CEO of 100,000 people, you go, no. Even if it's the son or daughter of the founder, we go, no. We don't care about your last name. You just don't have enough experience to do that. Now, in a startup, you and a dog, a 25-year-old is fine. You pet the dog and give it food and you're fine. But when it comes to being at a senior level in a big Canadian bank, you need someone with a lot of experience and the wisdom and the knowledge and the network and the connections to do it effectively. So I think there's good reason for older people in charge, but at a certain point, you're not there yet, Kyle, your boss will be younger than you. And this is quite a solitary moment because you go, that's not how it should work. I am younger than my boss. My boss is not younger than me. And so you realize that maybe you've not hit your peak, but things didn't work out quite as you thought, as well as you thought they might have. But, that's going to happen to almost everyone eventually. And to a certain degree, you might go, I'm in my 60s, I don't care. Like, I don't want to be the boss. I'd rather be a sole performer or whatever you're doing and just let me go on and do what I'm really good at and make you a lot of money. Yeah. But, my generation is brought up to want to get promoted, want to climb up the ladder, to want to be at the top. But there's only one person at the top. And then if that's really your dream, it's going to frustrate you if you don't get that position. And the chances are you probably won't. You might be number 2 or 3, not to, be negative, Kyle. But if you're the top of the Royal Bank, that's really, really astonishing to get that high up.
Yeah, those pyramids get pretty thin at the top as you go higher and higher. Love to talk, before we wrap up, about innovation. In terms of creating products and services, the world of finance has, long been on a quest for innovation. They deliver those products more efficiently. We've got, fintech evolving in a big way, Web3, all these derivative products over the years. In your book, you talk about building a culture of innovation, and you offer a 5-step approach. So the 5 steps, where I have the book in front of me, actually, it was add diverse perspectives, tap into the trenches of the organization, share information across horizontal and vertical structures, establish a flexible workplace, and value thinkers with fresh ideas who are newer to the industry. Would you be willing to kind of walk us through that paradigm a bit?
No, absolutely. When you think about it, there's 2 big schools of strategy. One is Mintzberg from McGill and Porter from Harvard. And we liked Porter. We gave him an honorary doctorate 5 or 6 years ago at McGill, and I interviewed him for an hour for the Globe and Mail. And he was a prof of mine years ago at Harvard. Henry came to McGill to work with, so he's a good friend and someone I've spent an enormous amount of time with. So Mintzberg is more, Porter is top down, where the CEO with their team comes up with the ideas, maybe gets McKinsey and Bain or BCG to help them with it. And the ideas are theirs, and the rest of us kind of sleep and follow. Now, on the emergent model, which is Mintzberg is saying, is that actually what you want to encourage is a culture of innovation where ideas bubble up everywhere. And to some degree, people that are boundary spanners, have a foot in the real world, which is changing, and a foot in our organization, are a wonderful source of ideas. Because they're newer to the market, they don't have, the ideas from the past strangling their thinking, and they're talking to real customers, real suppliers. They're out there. They're hearing what competitors are doing. So the idea is to encourage a culture of innovation where ideas bubble up. So senior management job is not to have the ideas, but to recognize good ones when they come up and tap on their shoulder, provide resource, and spread strategy from ideas emerging from the frontline troops. And when I've talked to hundreds of CEOs about this, because I've been working with Mintzberg for years, and most say it's a combination of thereof. That it's top down and the board's got to approve it, and it's got to come from our most senior people, our most experienced people. But those people do things where they tap into the frontline troops and they look for ideas that are emerging out there. And some interesting companies like Oliver Wyman, I'm writing an article on this, the CEO has a strategy council of young people. So the CEO and their senior team comes up with the ideas, but they run them by Gen Zs and say, here's what we're thinking. What do you guys think? And they kind of tweak and adjust the strategy based on what they know, what they hear, what they see out there. And the strategy be a bit different. So what I would argue is that strategy comes from the top, but also from the bottom. And CEOs say, yeah, both ones work in our company. Now, we hold CEOs responsible for the strategic choices and hold their feet to the fire and maybe fire them if it goes badly. But what these days world, it's a combination of from the top and from the bottom working together to come up with strategies in most industries.
We've talked about a lot, and I think we owe it to our listeners to try to leave them with maybe like a short list, just something easier to remember. So if you could summarize kind of 2, 3, maybe 4 really actionable takeaways from this call, what would they be?
One is about introverts. So introverts are great leaders. This is contrary to what a lot of people have been taught in the past. Introverts love you. You're great leaders. I'm an extrovert, but I need to have you as part of my leadership team, and I'll work for you. Secondly, we were made that way. It's DNA. That's the Harvard study. So don't feel guilty that God made you that way. It's all right. But third point is be an adult and act like an ambivert. Because that's called being like, around grade 3, you lose your name when you take your kid to school, Kyle. You're no longer Kyle, you're Susan's father. And if you get upset, the other parents go, grow up. You're taller, you make more money, you have more education. You beat Susan on every level other than cuteness. She's just cuter than you, and we accept that. And that's fine. But there's times to step back and not dominate if you're an extrovert. And if you're an introvert, it's times to step up and inspire and lead, maybe quieter than I would, but be an adult. So I think those are 3 messages I would have from the introverted side. From the viewpoint of Generation Y, it depends whether I'm talking to older people, younger people. For older people number 1 point is listen more, talk less, because you need to learn from young people. Second point is emotions are as valuable as thought, largely. Not entirely, but largely. And 2 points for Gen Z friends. 1, you're not the center of the universe. Like I spend my time praising them to older people, but come on, other people are important too. You're not the center of the universe. So be a bit humble. But second, reverse mentor your boss and your boss's boss in a nice way, but reverse mentor them for sure.
One final question I try to ask everyone. If you weren't doing what you're doing now, what would you be doing?
I would probably be a retired IBM executive, partly because it's so demanding to turn out the numbers years after year. So my friends that I was with there back in the day and have gone up, they made a lot more money than I have, but they're exhausted and they're enjoying their money and traveling the world with their spouse and working on warmer weather than being in Montreal or Toronto. Probably that's where I'd be, but I don't like today, Mintzberg is 84. He's not older, he's just more famous. And he, as long as your mind is there, if your mind's gone, that's one thing. But he turned out his 30th book. I interviewed him about it a couple of months ago in front of hundreds of McGill alumni, and everybody's excited to be in the room with him. So the advantage as a professor, I'm getting older and, losing the plot occasionally, as I've done here. I forgot what I was talking about but with Bombardier. But what it is that I know thousands of students I've taught, and I run into them all the time. So it's a sense of, hey, I want to hear what Karl's thinking about, because 10 years ago I had something interesting to say. He might well have something interesting to say today. And by being with a dozen young people that work for me part-time, it makes me today's person more than most people my age. So I probably would be retired, better off, but not having as much fun.
That's a great answer. Where can our listeners go to learn more about you or to connect with you?
Probably the easiest thing is Google Karl. It's an advantage of having an unusual spelled name. Karl with a K, Moore, 2 O's, Moore. Just Google me and look at my listen to my radio show, Forbes blog. I do columns for the Globe on Indigenous leaders every couple of weeks or so. So there's a couple things there. If they Google me and look at the Globe or Forbes or Bell Media, they'll find some hopefully interesting stuff.
Well, Professor Moore, this has been really great. I want to thank you once more for your time and your insights. And for our listeners and fans out there that love Net Learnings, please don't be shy to leave us a review or a rating on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Net Learnings. This podcast is powered by CFI, an organization on a mission to enhance the skills, knowledge, and productivity of finance and banking professionals. If you enjoyed what you heard in this episode, make sure to follow Net Learnings wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, or visit us online at corporatefinanceinstitute.com/podcast. See you next time.